I heard we got locked out again. I don't know what's going on at the door.
Are you taking
Unless somebody's playing an elaborate trick on all of it. Alright, so with all of that said, we'll talk about the so-called Federalist era and then the revolution, quote unquote, not really a revolution, of 1800. Obviously, probably, I would hope, most of you know that once the Constitution was ratified, George Washington was elected the first president, serves 2 terms, and then voluntarily stepped down. We didn't have term limits for presidents back then. And he gave a speech when he was deciding to step down and not run again, which a lot of people thought was great, because remember, some of the people that were opposed to giving the federal government this extra power under the new Constitution were worried maybe that presidency would become like a monarchy. And so for Washington to voluntarily step aside and make way for someone new was great. But he gives a speech when he steps down, and he warns the young American nation about several things, one of which was splitting into geographical factions, North and South, so basically kind of predicting a civil war that would come 60 years later. But he also warned about political parties. So people like Washington that were wealthy and kind of elitist looked down on this idea of political parties, but they didn't heed Washington's warning. And what essentially develops, taking the same name from the people who supported ratification, is a Federalist Party. We'll talk about people associated with the Federalist Party like Hamilton. And then an opposition party develops known as the Democratic Republicans. No direct relation to either current political party. They become associated with Jefferson. And the Federalists, John Adams was a Federalist too, so they controlled the presidency for 1, 2, 3 terms. And then in the election in 1800, Jefferson wins. So this is the first time in American history where we had a question of would there be a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, and there was, and that's why they call it the Revolution in 1800. So, oops. Just very briefly on Washington's presidency, though. I mean, if there were any American to fit this description, it's probably Washington. He's basically an aristocrat without a title. You know what I mean? He's not literally an aristocrat, but that's kind of the way he carried himself and kind of the way he conducts his affairs, with a lot of pomp and circumstance, you might say. For example, I believe when he stepped down, like he made a big show of, or no, rather, I'm sorry, when he assumed the presidency, remember he had been a military leader. When he assumed the presidency, he had a big deal about surrendering his sword. Like it was this ceremonial laying down of his role as a general and assuming this political position. He surrounds himself, though, with bright-minded individuals who, as it turns out, some of whom had very different ideas about how to govern. But he makes Hamilton the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton will be in charge of fiscal and monetary policy. And he made Jefferson the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State, if you don't know, is in charge of all of America's diplomats, and embassies, and foreign relations. But those two, along with several others, like you have a Secretary of War and various other secretaries within the executive administrative branch, essentially become the first cabinet, the first presidential cabinet. I skipped over the rule of law. That was the point about surrendering the sword. He was making a big deal about saying, you know, now we've adopted this Constitution, we all submit to the rule of law. But what's interesting about this first presidential cabinet is that it devolves and divides into competing camps. And those sort of camps, like groups of individuals who think one way versus another, they become associated with either Hamilton or Jefferson and become the leaders of those first two political parties that I was talking about. For Hamilton and people that think like him, they will coalesce into the Federalist Party. And for Jefferson and people that think like him, they will coalesce into the Democratic Republican Party, sometimes referred to as the Jeffersonian Republican Party.
I'm sorry.
What? What do you got? Hit me.
No, I just put like modern, so old, and I'm like, okay, that's why they got that. That makes sense.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You said him laying down the sword, that was part of rule of law?
Yeah, it's a way of saying I'm submitting to the rule of law. I'm not going to be like a military dictator. If I'm going to assume this position in these, the civilian government as this first executive leader, this president, I don't want to be associated with leading the military at the same time. So it's this sort of symbolic way of sort of bowing down to the rule of law, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'll say a lot more about what these two parties stand for on a different slide, just kind of introducing you to the general divide here. One of the things that splits these two camps are the economic policies that Hamilton proposes that are opposed strongly by Jefferson and others. That's one of the things that creates this divide in the first place. Hamilton wants to do this whole list of things, and Jefferson and some others are like, hey, wait a minute, that flies in the face of the America that we're trying to create. So what were some of these things? First of all, it was Hamilton's idea to do away with the old Confederation currencies. Obviously, as you pointed out, the completely devalued continental currency. And then remember, all the states had their own different currencies, the Massachusetts pound, the Rhode Island pound, etc. And then, like we were saying, during the war, with no way to raise revenue, Continental Congress had printed a shitload of paper money, but there was nothing to back it up, and it becomes worthless. And that's when the money printing started shifting to the states, all of whom sort of went about it very differently. Hamilton's proposal was to do away, scrap all of that, and to establish a national currency, a new national currency in gold and silver coin in various denominations. And this becomes the US dollar. So it wouldn't be this paper money that had the chance to become worthless. It would be specie, in effect, gold and silver coin printed in different numerical denominations based upon this concept of the US dollar. Hand in hand with this is how did Hamilton want to handle the issue of the war debt that both the United States as a federal entity and the various states themselves all were carrying still at that time. The United States owed like $52 million to creditors.
Back then or today?
In that day's money, I believe. Yeah, so they're looking an incredible amount. To the French, to the Dutch. There's domestic debt as well. They borrowed some $12 million from foreigners. The government, I think we mentioned this last time, either I did or one of you did, that the government had basically issued IOUs to soldiers in the Continental Army during the war. They had for expenditures, for seizures of grain or other foodstuffs that the Army needed and so on. And people are still holding on to those. And on top of that, the state governments themselves owed some $25 million to various different entities. One answer to this was for the U.S. to perhaps pass and enact protective tariffs, which is kind of ironic if we're remembering mercantilism and how that worked and what all led to the American Revolution in the first place. But this would be taxes on the importation of goods from abroad that would make people want to buy American, essentially. That you could tax the importation of things like firearms and ammunition, textiles, wood products, glass, not just manufactured goods, but things like tobacco and salt and indigo. And that people would be, again, compelled to buy from American producers. Otherwise, if they didn't, they would pay the tax on it, and that tax revenue would be revenue that could help pay down the debt. There's also, though, what they call excise taxes, most notably the whiskey tax, which is kind of a misleading name because it wasn't just a tax on the production of whiskey. It's an alcohol, a liquor made from distillation of grains or corn, but on all spirits, on all liquor, that hit small farmers so hard they actually rose up at one point in a rebellion known as the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania.
So wait, why did they do that again?
So they're trying to think of ways, and again, note the irony of what, when we had the causes of the American Revolution lecture, they're holding this massive debt. Like, how does the government raise revenue in order to help offset that? One thing you could do is say, well, we've got farmers all over the country who are producing and selling whiskey. Why don't we tax that? Similar to like now, it's like, hey, we legalize marijuana. At least you could tax it and it would be government revenue, right? In the same way that we tax things like cigarettes heavily and whatnot.
True.
So, well, I don't think the high-minded individuals like Hamilton, who was a merchant from New York City, understood the values and uses of things like whiskey in the backcountry, in the more rural areas, where it was used for like barter and was almost like a currency.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's what I was just
One of the
saying.
major things with Hamilton, as compared to other politicians that you might like less, like Aaron Burr at the time, was that Hamilton did not like or care about the rights of the poor.
Yeah.
So things like that, where like a barter system existed, he would not have much sympathy for, even if he was like fully aware.
Very true. And what you'll see once we talk through this and then look at the two different parties, that's the sort of stance of Hamilton. He wants to steer America towards a manufacturing nation, a more urban nation, a nation where sort of the wealthy can get wealthier and the sort of middle class can rise up in society. He's not so much concerned with people like the average farmer who depend on the production of whiskey. Jefferson, even though you all know Jefferson is a millionaire slave owner, but he at least sought to position himself as kind of the opposite of that, a guy who did care about sort of the average farmer. So it's a good point to raise, but this is just an example of another form of taxation. I think I told you it was called an excise tax. I guess I don't have a dry erase marker, so you don't have to write that down, but tax on a production as opposed to a tax on an import, right, like a tariff. What else can we say? Creation of a national postal service that could generate some revenue, okay. And then also, Hamilton really championed the notion of looking at a national debt as more of a public credit. So what do I mean by that? The idea of not saying to yourself as a federal government, hey, we got this massive debt, we got to pay it all down. And get rid of it and not have any debt at all. But more in thinking like, look, we're going to operate continually with debt, and it's fine as long as we can make our debt payments, right? You hear people in the last few weeks talking about if Congress doesn't pass, a new budget, America might default on its debts and not be able to meet its debt obligations. That would be very bad. But it has not happened. And go all the way back to this moment in Hamilton saying, look, you can carry debt as long as you can make your payments. Think of it less of a way of carrying this burden of debt and more like, hey, we can have a public credit where we're constantly being infused with revenue that we can use to grow America's economy. So in other words, there's no need to permanently or fully pay it off as long as you are credit worthy. So he proposes in that vein that the government be responsible for the face value of the debt certificates that people were holding at that time. A lot of those had collapsed in value, as I was saying earlier. But he also proposed paying that value to whoever currently held those certificates, not the person to whom they were originally issued, and not necessarily right then and there at that moment. What he wanted to do is roll those debt certificates over into new bonds, which would be payable later and that would earn interest. And these certificates then could become effectively what they would call government securities that could be traded just like any other commodity or just like legal tender. So think about how nowadays, if you have a sum of money and you don't want to be reckless with it and invest it in a stock that maybe will decrease dramatically in value for whatever reason, and you want to put it somewhere safe where you won't touch it for 20 or 30 years and it will earn interest. Not a ton, but you could put in $1,000 and then 20, 30 years later take out like, you know, 12, 1,300, 1,400, whatever. You can buy government bonds. You can do this right now. And this is what Hamilton was proposing. He was like, think of these debt certificates, these IOUs, as government bonds. We'll pay the original value plus interest, but we don't have to pay it all right now. You can stagger this out. People can trade these things. That maybe that'll increase the value as we go. And this can be a way for the government to continually operate by saying, government needs money. Invest with the government. We will pay you back with interest. And so the government will always be carrying that debt, but it's, you know, always able to eventually meet that obligation. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, that's a really genius way to bump it.
Well, you know, some of the things he proposed do become permanent fixtures of sort of economic America, if you will, or fiscal or monetary America, like obviously the dollar in this system of public credit / national debt. Some of the things he proposes don't end up getting approved. Like, for example, remember, part of what Hamilton wants to do is make America more of an industrialized manufacturing nation to kind of bring it up to speed with Britain and France and other countries. Remember, as colonies, they didn't do hardly any manufacturing. Hamilton very much liked to very quickly change that. So in that vein, he proposes giving government subsidies to certain individuals who would manufacture things, or to businesses that would manufacture things. Government subsidy means money to help you do something that would hopefully be beneficial for the entire nation. But in this government subsidy plan to encourage domestic manufacturing, that never does come to be. He never is able to generate enough support to make that actually happen. Now, one thing that he does get to actually happen that would later be undone, as we'll see, is creating a Bank of the United States. He proposed a federal central bank which would handle all of the government's revenue, but would also have private investors that would use hard currency or those newly secured government bonds to buy stock in that bank. And that bank would then have a significant role in sort of steering the economy of the United States. Today, we have such a thing. What's it called? The Federal Reserve, or the Fed. Usually just referred to as the Fed.
Oh, yeah, I know the Fed when I read the Jim joke.
Yeah. So the Fed and its board of directors have a very, very significant role to play. Typically, when you hear about the Fed these days, it's because of interest rates. So the Fed decided today to raise interest rates by 1/4 of a point. For a long time during the COVID recession and periods before, we had like the interest rate was 0. What that means is that encourages people to borrow money. When the Fed raises an interest rate and says, you know, the money that we loan out to lower banks who then loan to private banks, it's going to cost you more to borrow that money. Fewer people will borrow less and less money. Why would you do that? Why would you want to put the brakes on the amount of money that's going into the economy?
Because we're going to start giving out too much money.
Right, because of what's happening right now, which is inflation. That's why the Fed in the last several quarters has raised the interest rate to try to control that. So
they trying to fix all that stuff.
I know it. So this was the kind of thing that the role that Hamilton envisioned for this Bank of the United States to play. Opponents, like obviously Jefferson, were like, no, this is terrible. This is a tool of the very wealthy to help the rich get richer. Those private investors are going to make big time money off of this, you know, what's essentially a quasi-government entity. This is not going to be fair for the average American. And so what Hamilton's going to have to do in this case is strike a deal in order to get that bank created. And it is going to be created. As we'll see in a week or two, an individual comes along a couple decades later and makes it his mission to destroy that bank. And we didn't have a central bank until the Fed was created in the early 20th century. Questions? Okay.
Wait.
Okay. What you got?
Okay, never mind.
Okay.
Never mind.
All right. So I've been mentioning Jefferson. Right there with him, in opposition to some of Hamilton's policies, many of them, is Madison. They feel that, in particular, like I was just saying, that Bank of the United States would put too much power in the hands of a few rich individuals. They also questioned whether or not either Congress or the President had the authority to create such an entity in the first place under the Constitution. Hamilton's argument was there are certain phrases in the Constitution that give the government control over quote-unquote commerce and the power to do things that are, quote, necessary and proper for the efficient running of the government, and to give the government the authority to promote the, quote, general welfare of American citizens. So he says Commerce Clause, necessary and proper, general welfare, all of these are constitutional authority arguments to make when we're talking about can the government create this federal bank.
So didn't he, I guess, oppose the money decisions Hamilton would make and thought it didn't have the power to do it, but then he later himself did the Louisiana Purchase?
Yeah. Yes, that is a fact. In fact, I think we're going to get there actually today. So yeah, they're not necessarily. I mean, there are areas in which you could question the consistency of Jefferson's argument and thinking. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did contradict himself when he kind of put the lockdown on embargoes and all that.
Yeah, that as well. And look, let's remember, and let's not forget, this is the guy, for all of his genius, who did write the line in the Declaration, all men are created equal, when he was himself a slave owner. So there are contradictions.
I get really upset when people try to paint Jefferson specifically as a good slave owner.
Yeah, there's historically been a sort of effort to do that, and I think most modern historians, I mean, it is what it is, you know what I mean? Yeah, so I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
That being said, for Jefferson, he viewed America as sort of developing in a different way. So Hamilton wants to see manufacturing, development of industry, growth of cities, power in the hands of wealthy elites like bankers and merchants like himself. Jefferson saw more of America as an agricultural republic. In his mind, and again, knowing that he himself is a very, very, very wealthy plantation owner, for him, that was not the essence of America. The essence of America is what they called back then the yeoman farmer. What is a yeoman farmer? It's not a rich plantation owner like Jefferson or Madison, but it is a landowning farmer. Like landowning farmers who were not rich but also not poor, just the average American farmer. The everyday average American farmer and his family. To Jefferson, that's what America was about. And you needed to enact policies that would help those people in what they do, as opposed to hitting them with things like the whiskey tax, right? And that in that way, you could grow America as this agricultural republic. In fact, to your point, one of the arguments he would make in making the Louisiana Purchase is think about all this land that we can now have people move out to the frontier. And of course, you would have to murder or otherwise put on reservations the Native Americans. But setting that aside, this could all be a breadbasket for the growth of an agricultural America when farmers could move out there and settle. Let's see. Hamilton thought that argument was short-sighted and naive, and that if America wanted to do what Jefferson himself said in the Declaration, remember those first lines, to assume among the powers of the earth that separate and equal station among those powers of the earth, like Britain and France and Spain, that it needed to encourage manufacturing. But that manufacturing package was something that Jefferson and Madison deeply opposed, that subsidies for manufacturing. And they had acceded to the U.S. dollar, they had acceded to the public credit / debt program, and the creation or the creation of government bonds from those essentially debt certificates or IOUs. But there were some things they would put their foot down on, and there were some things they would compromise on. And you know, I don't remember why, but yesterday I had the realization that as of next year, it will have been a quarter of a century since I started college. That's really, really depressing.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
At least you
You
done.
made it this far.
Right? Right? I'm going to keep on. I'm going to keep on trucking. The point there being, sometimes I just make assumptions like, yeah, you know, Hamilton on Broadway just came out a couple years ago. Surely everybody knows Hamilton, and then it's like crickets. So exactly. So rather than assume that anyone is in any way familiar with Lin-Manuel Miranda's Broadway musical, let me play this clip. So Lin-Manuel Miranda is a songwriter and playwright, and I don't know, what felt like 2 or 3 years ago, is probably 10 years ago, he premieres this musical all about the life of Alexander Hamilton. And it becomes like the greatest Broadway sensation, like in your or my lifetime. One of the guys I like a lot, one of my favorite musicians and actors, a guy named Leslie Odom, plays Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr, if you don't know, is the guy who shoots and kills Alexander Hamilton in a duel. They were still doing things like duels back then, where you would line up back to back and you each had a pistol, and you take however many paces that you and your people had decided with their people, and you turn and see who can shoot each other first. This is what learned, wealthy people in the American government at the time.
I wonder did they realize it was very stupid.
And they kept doing it for a few decades. I alluded earlier, without saying his name, to Andrew Jackson. He was in a couple of duels, actually got shot in one and lived through it. I don't know. Point being, Aaron Burr is thus a major character, played in the original Broadway musical by a guy named Leslie Odom, who's fantastic. And you can see in this clip, Burr is getting very upset that he's the one left out of where all of the big time decisions are being made. He's very jealous of Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson. And in this part of the musical, Jefferson and Madison go to sit down at dinner with Hamilton to talk about a compromise. And Burr is essentially bitching because he's been left out.
Everybody was invited to the tea party except for him.
Precisely that, yes. So let's see what Aaron Burr can tell us. Oh, hopefully it's not too loud. Of course, we have to sit through an ad.
I'm about to say that mustache don't look right.
Thanks a lot, Hamilton.
Mr. Second. Mr. Burr, sorry. And did you hear the news about good old General Mercer? No, you know we never screwed. We named it after him, the Mercer legacy disappeared. Sure. All they had to do was die. Yeah, that's a lot less work. We ought to give it a try. How are you going to get your dead man through? I guess I'm going to finally have to listen to you. Really? Talk less. Smile more. Whatever it takes to get my plan on the Congress floor. Madison, Jefferson, or Mercer. Well, hate to sin love the sinner. Hamilton. I'm sorry, Burr, I gotta go. Decisions are happening over dinner.
So I don't know how much you caught because it's kind of garbled, but he's like, "How are you going to get your debt plan through, buddy?" He's
Yeah,
like,
he's
"I got some ideas."
Yeah.
Hamilton insults him, and he's like, "Hang on, I'm going to go make some decisions with Jefferson and Madison here."
Kind of
This
represents
portrays
Facebook.
like a switch in their ideologies where like Hamilton begins to become more focused on realpolitik
Yep.
and like hiding what it actually values and just doing what needs to be done, and
Yeah.
Burr gets his ambition and passion.
Yes, exactly.
Two Virginians and an immigrant walk into a room diametrically opposed.
Two Virginians and an immigrant walk into a room diametrically opposed. That makes sense. Madison and Jefferson were the Virginians. Hamilton is technically an immigrant because he was born in one of the Caribbean islands, I think Barbados.
Oh, so he's like, why is he running with them? Because they not even on the.
Yeah.
Opposed. They emerged with a compromise having opened doors that were previously closed. The immigrant emerges with unprecedented financial power, a system can shake however he walks. The Virginians emerge with the nation's capital, and here's the guest resistance. Who else would know what would happen? Who would happen? Who would happen? Who else would know what would happen? Who would happen? Who would happen? Nobody knows how the game is played. The art of the trade on sausage is made. We just assume that happens. No one else is in the room when it happens.
Them background dancers got it.
Right? For real.
I don't know.
I think they're reviving it. I mean, it's not the original cast, but I think it's going around touring America again this year. But so I don't know if you caught what he said there. That they go into the room diametrically opposed, and there's a compromise where Hamilton will have unprecedented financial power. Did you catch what Jefferson and Madison got? The nation's capital. Prior to that time, America's capital had been Philadelphia or New York. Washington, D.C. did not exist. You know where Washington, D.C. is? It's right there where Virginia borders Maryland. And so what Madison and Jefferson wanted is to say we need to build from scratch a brand new capital for the purpose of being America's capital, and we want it in the South. And so their half of the compromise of 1790 was for Hamilton to accede to and to support then the building of what would become Washington District of Columbia as the new capital, basically in the back door of Virginia, right there in the heart of the South.
Hamilton was in New York. His in-laws were in New York and everything, so he was seen as someone who would be supposed to support New York.
Exactly, yeah. And so for him to agree to this was a big deal. Make sense? Questions? And just a brief aside, the guy that designed Washington, D.C., if you go to D.C. and you ride the subway there, one of the main stations in the heart of D.C. is named after him. His last name's L'Enfant. He's French. There are elements you can see of that. If you go to Washington, it's more spread out, so the boulevards are wider, it's more spacious, but like the buildings are not over a certain height, which is exactly the same as if you were to go to, say, Paris. But also, too, just the way that it was designed was to locate, the nation's Capitol building right in the center, and then down the end of the National Mall. Eventually, there would be this monument built to Washington, and then the White House is in that same vicinity, and so on. But in any case, what can we say about these first political parties? The Democratic Republican. They are, in some ways, the standard bearers, if you will, the people who take their cue from their point of departure and from, to put it another way, the anti-federalist. So one of the ways we see that is that they favor the retention of authority by the states. They were pro-power for the states and very much concerned with the federal government having too much power, particularly if it were to adopt all of the things that Hamilton wanted. And I should say that even though Washington abhorred or didn't like the idea of political parties, in his thinking and his policies, he is essentially a Federalist. And so we're talking about Washington and his successor, John Adams, along with Hamilton being the Federalists. But more on the Democratic Republicans, they more specifically feared the power that under Hamilton and Washington and Adams would be afforded to rich bankers and speculators and merchants at the expense of yeoman farmers. Remember, they thought the yeoman farmer was the essence of America, the just average everyday farmer, as you said, and that they would rely on those individuals, those landowning farmers who were not poor but not super rich, to in turn elect in this republic virtuous types like Jefferson and Madison, who were what they called back then disinterested, which doesn't carry the same meaning today. It would sound like they're not interested in something. What it meant is essentially they are so wealthy and have plantations with hundreds of slaves, and kind of like I mentioned the other day about Jefferson reading Locke, they have the time to devote to politics. They have the time to devote to running a government. They have the time to devote to, you know, reading political philosophy and being learned, knowledgeable individuals, rather than having to get up and work every day in a field for their living, right? One other thing about the Democratic Republicans, they tended to be pro-French in their foreign policy. You might say they were then Francophiles. France, though, was in the midst of an ongoing revolution of its own that by that time was starting to get out of hand. Obviously, if you take my world history, we'll talk a lot more about this. I don't want to do like the French Revolution in 30 seconds, but I will try. France had an absolute monarchy during the American Revolution. They had a monarch with like total power and authority. So when they engaged in revolution, it was much more radical than the American Revolution, where you were overthrowing at least a constitutional monarchy that had a parliament with some power. And they ended up beheading the king and the queen. And they then became, leaders of the revolution became so obsessed that other people were trying to subvert or thwart, stop the revolution, that or reverse it. They started just executing people left and right by the guillotine. And that was what was going on. And so there were a lot of people in America that were associated with more Federalist thinking that thought France was getting out of control with their concept of liberty. If we were to support something like that, it would lead to that kind of violence and so on. But for Jefferson, it was, it showed the fervor of their commitment to liberty. France, remember, had also been an ally during the Revolution. And France was at that time at war with Britain. After the French Revolution succeeded in overthrowing the monarchy, scared other European mother countries like Britain went to war with revolutionary France, worried that that same thing would spill over into their own countries. So it seemed for some obvious that in that war, America ought to return the favor from the revolution and support France. Others, like who were more Federalist in their thinking, thought that what you should do was restore a good relationship with Britain, focus on being pro-British and supporting the United Kingdom for trade purposes. These were the competing arguments in terms of foreign policy. For the Democratic Republicans, though, they would point to the so-called Jay Treaty as a sign of British treachery. John Jay, you'll recall, was one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, and he becomes the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. In the Jay Treaty, which was a treaty signed with the British at the conclusion of the Revolution, Jay gave the British months to vacate forts in America and on the frontier. It let them off the hook for paying for slaves that had been lured away by the British Army. Since we didn't talk about the war itself, I didn't mention this, but during the war at one point in the South, the British Army issued a proclamation that told slaves that if they were to run away, they could join the ranks of the British Army and become free. And a lot of them did, for obvious reasons. The new American government, some people try to make the argument the British ought to pay for the value of those slaves, but Jay did not make them do that. While at the same time, they agreed that planters should have to pay debts from before the war, of their own. And what did America get in return? It got limited trading rights with British colonies in the Caribbean and a vague promise to revisit disputed issues of where the border ought to be with Canada, and some damage claims from merchant ship owners.
Treaty?
Yeah, this is all under the Jay Treaty, which really the big takeaway is that Democratic Republicans thought it gave the British way too much. And, you know, Jay is a Federalist and a pro-British guy, so that's one of the things that irritated the Democratic Republicans. Now remember, the Federalists favor the continued strengthening of federal authority at the expense of the states, which they thought could help with the development of a strong merchant class, a strong banking class, ongoing development of American trade, especially with Britain, and remember, an increase in manufacturing and what would eventually become industrialization. Now, as being pro-British in their foreign policy, they had their own version of the Jay Treaty, something to be pissed off about and point the finger at the French. And this is the so-called XYZ affair that they viewed as evidence of French treachery. It came to light that at one point the French government had attempted to bribe the United States for a treaty and guarantees of peace at a time where the French were themselves angry about terms of the Jay Treaty and had been seizing American ships in the Caribbean. Remember, France still has colonies down in the Caribbean. They've offered the United States $12 million to stop doing that, to stop the French Navy from seizing American ships and all of the stuff of value that were traversing the seas of the Caribbean. And at one point, news leaked out, and the secret agents who were trying to negotiate this on back channels of the American government were codenamed X, Y, and Z. So it becomes known as the XYZ affair, the French government's attempt to bribe the American government to stop harassing American merchant ships in the Caribbean.
So it was French spies. So it was French spies.
Yes, yes. What happens instead is a quasi-war develops in the Caribbean, with each side seizing the other's ships. The United States tries to quickly build up a navy of its own that could protect American ships in the Caribbean, and to say, to hell with you, France will seize your ships that are also your merchant ships in the Caribbean. And even though the two sides never do formally declare war on one another, you have this sort of low-grade state of naval warfare in the Caribbean at that time, when America was trying to increase its maritime presence. Maritime means like sea-based. So we're trying to beef up what you would call our merchant marine, or our merchant ships. So when John Adams, the Massachusetts lawyer, succeeds Washington as president, opposition to Federalist policies, even though obviously Adams won the race, so they do have significant support, but opposition to Federalist policies gets so high, and there are so many protests in the streets and denunciations or criticisms of Federalist policies in various newspapers, that Adams, as president, fears for the integrity of his presidency and for really his own safety to a point. And while the Federalists still controlled a majority of the seats in Congress, they work with President Adams to pass what becomes known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. Alien in this case refers to legal terminology for immigrants. In this case, immigrants that would be considered quote-unquote illegal, and that the president could have deported or imprisoned without trial. if they posed a threat.
Which is interesting because they had literally no process for immigration, legal or illegal at this time.
Exactly. So there wasn't really anything on the way of what we would consider immigration policy, period, and yet they passed these laws that give the president really unchecked authority to detain people. I mean, literally imprison them if he thought they were a threat to the integrity of his presidency. The thinking here was that there were a bunch of X, Y's, and Z's running around. A bunch of French spies or subversives or whatever, and we need to detain or deport these people for the protection of the presidency. Yeah.
Isn't this act like still in place, just not practiced?
That's a subsequent sedition act that we will talk about that actually was in the news fairly recently for a reason I can't remember. Oh, no, I remember, but I'm not going to go there. Yeah, we will talk about that sedition act as well. So sedition, good point. What is sedition? It could be anything that would be interpreted as a threat to the government. Could even be what we call seditious speech, like if you're out there saying things about, taking down the government or whatever. Yeah, now you see. So what this did was make it illegal to threaten a president, made it illegal to, say or publish or write anything that was seen as a threat to the president or the integrity of Congress. And you could be jailed for that as well. Of course, opponents of that would see that as an infringement of free speech and freedom of the press. And that would include Democratic Republicans who were appalled and outraged and see these as flying in the face of the Bill of Rights. Madison and Jefferson are among those who worked with their state legislatures to pass resolutions in opposition to this. In their case, that would be the Virginia resolution. There's also a Kentucky resolution. They put forth the notion that state governments had the authority to nullify federal laws that they deemed to be unconstitutional. Nullification, the notion that a state could use its own sovereignty to say these federal laws are void, they are null and void, they're not of any effect in our state. Obviously, that is a notion that not everyone would agree was constitutional or not, but they do put forth that idea. It's kind of strange considering that Madison basically wrote the Constitution and Jefferson was vice president at that very moment. Back then, if that seems strange, originally the vice president was like the second highest vote getter and wasn't like on a ticket with the president selected by that person as a candidate. So we realized that that didn't work really well. Consider any recent election and imagine that the person who came in second would become the vice president, and imagine how well that would go. And it went about as well as that here. And so we eventually amended the Constitution, but that does make it a little bit odd.
Oh,
yes.
In fact, for the one period of time in which the president and vice president were legitimately at odds, that was exactly one term in all of U.S. history.
Yeah.
We got the filibuster out of that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think probably you're all familiar with the concept of the filibuster, whereby in Congress, if one party or another is so opposed to something becoming law, you can simply use parliamentary procedure to hold the floor. And it used to be you would have to actually literally get up there and talk, and in order to prevent a vote happening on a bill. And you could read or say literally anything. Back in the 1960s, segregationist Southern senators in the Democratic Party at that time, Strom Thurmond of South Carolina got up there and read the Bible and various other things for like 24 hours to keep the Civil Rights Act from passing. Ted Cruz, some years ago, got up there and read Green Eggs and Ham. That's about the time that they changed the rules to where you don't actually have to hold the floor anymore. You can just say, I invoke the filibuster and prevent something from getting a vote. But yeah, the origins are here as well. But let us, where are we at on time? We got a few minutes, all right. Back to Hamilton, the production. Wow, that's atrocious.
It's the biggest family vacation ever.
Wow.
Act like they ain't never seen Guidos before.
Jersey Shore Family Vacation. New season premieres tonight at 8. Watch on
That is
MTV.
absolutely
Can we get
atrocious.
back to politics? Yo, every action has its equal opposite reaction. John Adams, the bed. I love the guy, but he's in trash. Or Alexander Hamilton, he is missing in action, so now I'm facing Aaron Burr with his own faction.
It could be argued that Burr was not a very good politician. In that election of 1800, when it's Burr and Thomas Jefferson, and Burr comes really close to becoming the president of the United States, he's back in that race by two different parties. That is how malleable his beliefs were.
People will say, boy, Burr's a handy guy to have with you in an election because he doesn't have really strict principles. Hamilton writes a letter saying, he has no principles. Like, why is that good? This cannot be good. It ends up that there's a tie between Burr and Jefferson. It gets thrown into the House to be decided. And so there's Hamilton facing the future of one or the other of these men who he really doesn't like are going to be president.
People are asking to hear my voice. The country's facing a difficult choice. If you were to ask me who I'd promote, Jefferson has my vote.
Thomas Jefferson becomes president, Aaron Burr becomes the vice president. When Jefferson ran for re-election, Burr goes back to New York State and runs for governor, only to find that he is again thwarted in his ambition by Alexander Hamilton, and Burr loses for governor. You know, at this point, Burr flies into a rage. It seems like at every stage of his career, the man blocking his path of advancement is the same Alexander Hamilton.
There is a third thing after this.
What's that?
Alexander Hamilton had not set it up in the banking system that poor people could get loans.
Yeah.
Like, you just couldn't.
Right.
And so Aaron Burr went through an elaborate scheme where he got government grants to make a water company.
Yeah.
That was actually a bank.
Yeah. Yeah.
That he used to undermine the entire financial system Hamilton had built.
Yeah. And then he killed him, right?
Yeah.
You know, I can see why they're doing it.
Right? So just this is the last of it. Just really quickly, a few things about Jefferson's, as you can see, 2 terms, as you just saw Leslie Odom talking about. Jefferson is elected and then re-elected with the support, in the first case, of Hamilton, his longtime opponent, who turns out disliked Burr even more, or distrusted him even more, one or the other or both. But when Jefferson gets elected, there's these questions about, oh my God, will there be a peaceful transfer of power? And there was. I mean, there's not like an actual revolution or anything. When we say the revolution of 1800, we mean the peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, right? Which has been the American tradition until fairly recently anyway, ever since. So what Jefferson does, though, is sets about undoing some of what the Federalists had done under Washington and Adams, not all. But he does engineer a drastic reduction in government spending at the federal level, and therefore at the same time is able to reduce federal government expenditures as well. Reduces the size of the Army and Navy, abolishes the whiskey tax and other population-based taxes. Tax collection under Jefferson's administration will be limited to customs duties and the sale of Western lands. And I'll say more about that in the next lecture, the federal sale of Western lands, the so-called Northwest Ordinance. We'll come back to that. But most importantly, though, there is no real revolution. There's no total reversal of federal policies. There's a continuity of government and that peaceful transfer of power. When I say austerity, appearance of austerity means being very, very tight with your spending, like not spending a lot, being very frugal, And so Jefferson wanted to go out of his way to give that appearance at least. And there are, some elements of that in reality. But when we say rolling back Federalist policy only somewhat, that's important because it would make it more difficult to have a peaceful transfer of power if the first thing a new administration did, representing a different political party, is obliterate everything the previous party administration had done, right? You would determine what are some of the sort of things that we dislike the most, and maybe we can do away with that, like, for example, the whiskey tax, but not everything. And there is, as you mentioned, Louisiana Purchase, a vast area of land that the United States gets for a very bargain price from France, which by that time was ruled over by a military dictator named Napoleon Bonaparte, who sets himself up as emperor and creates an army of the French people and very nearly conquers the entire European continent, but he needed money to finance that army. France at that time had regained control of Louisiana, which was not just what is the state of Louisiana here, but all of this land stretching from the Mississippi River all the way up nearly into the Pacific Northwest. Now, who actually lives in these areas are like the Apache and the Comanche and the Sioux and the Navajo and so on. And so,
New Orleans.
Although there is the city of New Orleans, which is the big get. Yeah, it had changed hands, and New Orleans has that multi-ethnic history of French, Spanish, West African, and everything else. But New Orleans, if you don't know, is at the very tip, the mouth of the Mississippi River, which is a massively important avenue of trade. And so controlling that port city was the real key. And if you got, these many thousands of acres of Indian land that maybe one day you could subdue the Indians and force them under reservations and use that land for farming, then that would be great. But it's going to be some time before that happens. Jefferson does famously send his guys, Lewis and Clark, out there to sort of survey what's out there, and they come back and they're like, yeah, there's a lot of Indians. It's flat, a lot of grassland, yeah. Anyway, finally then, one of the first really what we now call landmark decisions of the Supreme Court is rendered during this time, Marbury versus Madison. Adams, right before he left office, like literally his last evening in office, appointed a ton of judges that become known as the Midnight Judges. And Madison, and as being a part of Jefferson's cabinet, refused to sign the documents that would allow those judges to actually take their seats, seeing this as a power grab by Adams at the very last minute. And what the Supreme Court does is use this case, which is dealing with these judicial appointments, to take a big step that the Supreme Court had never taken before, which is to look at the law that governed how judges become judges, the Judiciary Act of 1789, and to say it was unconstitutional. To say there were elements of that law that did not meet the standards or requirements of the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, they established the Supreme Court's power of judicial review. It's actually not explicitly in the Constitution, but has been recognized ever since that the Supreme Court has the ability to review laws passed by Congress and executive orders of the President, and to say, are these constitutional or not? And if the determination is that they are not constitutional, if there is support of one of the other two branches, that law can be done away with or not enforced. As we'll see, there are times in American history where the Supreme Court says one thing, doesn't get support from either the President or Congress, and it more or less means nothing.
Also, this is something that no one ever mentions. During this entire time, the United States was at war with Muslim pirates, like right from the starting year of his term.
Yeah, you're talking about the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean?
Yes, the first Barbary War.
Yep. Yeah, that's actually one of the first great engagements of the United States Marine Corps. The halls of Montezuma and the shores of Tripoli being on the northern coast of Africa. Anyway, questions?
Was the Supreme Court considered a very weak power in the three branches until judicial review?
I think so. I think that would be fair to say. So, the fact that what they did here was, enforced, I think goes a long way in sort of bringing the Supreme Court on the par with the other two branches, yeah.
Because until just reveal what checks and balance power does the judiciary branch even have?
It's a good question, because there are checks on the court, but,
It hasn't found.
right, well, you could say, the president was impeached, the Chief Justice gets to preside over the trial. I mean, symbolic, right? But yeah, today, judicial review is the major check that the Supreme Court has had. And that's why Marbury is such a major decision.
Are judicial branches, like, more powerful than any other country, basically?
That's a good case could be made for that, I think, yeah. Right, and sometimes for good, sometimes for not so great. Yeah.
I was just going to follow up on what he said. I personally think the Supreme Court is probably the most powerful thing in America.
It has been recently, and that's why, and it's funny when we're talking about the appointment of judges, one of the most important things in a political party getting their candidate elected president is that the president can appoint judges, not just to the Supreme Court, but in our judiciary system, we have at the lowest level federal courts, like there's one in Atlanta, is the district court. And there are numerous judges, federal judges on that court. Also in Atlanta, there is one of the, I think, 12 courts of appeals of the United States. That's the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta. And there are, 20 some odd judges on that court. Those judges are really important because if you come out of the U.S. Courts of Appeals, you go then to the U.S. Supreme Court. So there is real power and value in getting control of the White House if you also control the Senate, right? Because the Senate has to approve these judicial appointments. So, but yeah, that's still a thing today to try to get as many judges in there to decide controversial or important cases the way you would want them to be decided, right? Okay, well that's it. Sorry it wasn't a 30-minute review day again. Really looking forward to that.
Before Jefferson's tenure under John Adams, with the Federalist mindset, wasn't America essentially like a pseudo-oligarchy?
That's certainly what Jefferson and Madison and others feared. That if you were to go